and as always, I want to start by thanking NYSCA, the New York State Council for the Arts, which funds our series and has for many years, and even through the pandemic, as we had to pivot and figure out how we're going to do this differently, their support never wavered, and I am really grateful for that, because it allows us to do things like bring Jack Wang to campus tonight. I also want to thank Mike and Anthony, who's back there working our IT stuff right now, for coming out and making this event available to an audience beyond our campus community here. And there's a live stream happening, and to the people in the stream, I just wanted to note that there is a live chat feature, and if during the Q&A passage or whenever you had questions or things that you wanted to reach out and say, I'll be monitoring the chat on my phone, so I can be your mouthpiece here if you would like to ask a question, and Jack will be able to answer it. And so tonight, I'm going to introduce Jack, and then Jack will come up and do a reading, and right after that, seamlessly, without me coming back up, we'll just pivot into Q&A. And so please feel free to think about any questions, ask them, take advantage of this opportunity to sort of chat with Jack Wang in a small and intimate space, which is one of the gifts of being at Wells. So I'm going to introduce Jack right now. He's the author of the story collection We Two Alone, which won the Danuta Gleed Literary Award from the Writers Union of Canada for the best debut collection in English. Upon granting him that award, 2 jury members described the book like this. I'm just going to read it because I thought it was really apt. It says, "In We Two Alone, Jack Wang has written an instantly engaging and achingly poignant collection of stories about people struggling to preserve their way of life and seeking stability, connection, and meaning. Focusing on Chinese immigrant experiences, Wang's stories range freely and easily across many decades and a dizzying assortment of geographies. All of Wang's characters are vividly rendered, their struggles and agonies richly conceived and indelibly portrayed. The writing throughout is atmospheric, highly visual, and peppered with startling and persuasive detail. Long after finishing it, We Two Alone lingers in the mind as a compassionate work by a profoundly talented writer who cares deeply about what it means to be human in turbulent times." I felt similarly reading this book. I too wanted to preface it for you by saying that the stories have stayed with me. In particular, they describe experiences that are deeply alien from my own, but they're rendered in ways that linger, that affect and expand my sense of self. And Jack gave a wonderful masterclass earlier today on the science of fiction, and we talked about one of the functions of fiction being to sort of understand fellow members of your species, right, in its sort of most basic form. And I think there is something, Jack was very careful to say, like, this does not describe contemporary literature and all of its nuance, but I think there is something at its core that has survived from that original impulse here. I feel like reading Jack's book is a private act with a kind of public resolution. I looked up at the end of each story feeling like my world of confidants, the world of people whose lives I've glimpsed into, has gotten just a bit bigger, and my empathy muscle just a little bit stronger. I think of that as the gift of great fiction, and I'm very grateful for it. Jack's work has been shortlisted for the Commonwealth Short Story Prize, longlisted for the Journey Prize, and he held the David T.K. Wang Creative Writing Fellowship at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England, which sounds rad. And he received, he's a 2021 NYSCA / New York Foundation for the Arts Artist Fellow in Fiction, and his novel In Progress, The Riveters, received a Research and Creation grant from the Canada Council for the Arts. Jack holds an MFA from the University of Arizona, a PhD from Florida State University, and he's currently an associate professor in the Department of Writing at Ithaca College. Originally from Vancouver, He lives in Ithaca with his wife, the novelist Angelina Mirabella, and their 2 daughters. I'm so glad he's here to share his work with us tonight. Please welcome Jack Wang.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. I appreciate that. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to all of you for being here. Appreciate you coming out on a rainy night. So my plan is this, to begin by actually giving you a little bit of a visual tour of the collection. Part of the reason is that with the short story collection, it's hard to get a sense of the entire book through the reading of a single story. But it's also a sense, to give you a sense of my research and maybe a little sense of myself by walking you through the stories. There are 6 short stories in the novella. And then I'll read from some of my work and take some questions. So this is a collection, as I say, of 6 stories and a novella about the Chinese diaspora over the past century. And the first story is a story called The Valkyries, and it's set in Vancouver, British Columbia, where I grew up exactly 100 years ago. It's about a Chinese laundry boy named Nelson Wu. This is a picture of a Chinese laundry from the early 20th century, from which I drew many of the details, the back room of the laundry where Nelson lives. And the figure of the Chinese laundry man or laundry boy is not unfamiliar. I wanted this laundry boy to be different, so one day he sets up on Pender Street. This is Pender Street in 1910. That chop suey house earns a mention in the story. And he goes to, let's see, this is not advancing. He goes to Denman Arena, which is, it actually burned down in 1936. But he tries out for a hockey team. But he's ostracized by the boys, isn't able to play. So he decides to try out for a women's team, the team called the Vancouver Valkyries, hence the title. Their rivals are the Vancouver Amazons, which is a real hockey team, was a real hockey team, and you can see they played exactly 100 years ago. This is a photo from the 21-22 season. And in fact, Guy Patrick, who's the coach, and Kit Carson, who's second from the left and the bottom, make appearances in the story. So the story switches locale from, and I know James, some of your students read this story, so this may be of particular interest to them, but story switches locale from Vancouver to Banff for the Banff Winter Carnival for a hockey tournament. There were women's tournaments in the early 20th century. Those carnival teepees also earn a mention in the story, as does the Ice Castle. This is actually a relatively early iteration of the Ice Castle that became quite elaborate at the Banff Winter Carnival. And this is a picture of Mather's Ring, where games in the story take place. That's Cascade Mountain in the background. And some sources suggest that this is a boys' game, but by my estimation, it's actually a women's game. If you look at some of the light jerseys, you just sort of make out the VA of the Vancouver Amazons jersey. And this is a photograph by a man named Byron Harmon. And I just love this photograph because these women look so alive, right? And they just look so joyous in approaching a game. And I wanted to capture, this era of women's hockey. When I was doing research for this story, I was in touch with a hockey historian by the name of Craig Bowlesby, and he shared this photograph with me. He believed it to be a photograph of a Chinese Canadian who played hockey, as you can see, in 1913, 1914. And it confirmed my intuition that Chinese Canadians had long participated in a game of hockey. And even if for some reason he is not of Chinese descent, nonetheless I think he's a potent symbol because hockey is very much part of the mythos of Canada. I think the desire to play is often represented a larger desire to belong. And, you know, I love the fact that these players have, you know, the maple leaf over their chest, right? That's part of what I was trying to suggest through hockey in this story. The next story is called The Nature of Things, and it's about a couple, Frank and Alice Young, who grew up together on a playground in Chinatown. This one, in fact, the one and only playground in Chinatown. And Frank goes on to become a doctor, but he cannot practice medicine in Canada in the 30s because the Chinese did not have a franchise and therefore couldn't join a professional society. So they take the Empress of Japan, and this is the Empress of Japan in Vancouver in the 30s. They take the Empress of Japan to Shanghai, where he's found a job as a doctor. And as the story says, they go to teeming, sprawling, magnificent Shanghai, which might have been Europe if not for the rickshaws and sandbags. But they promptly get caught up in the Second Sino-Japanese War. And you know, this is the focus of the story. The couple gets separated during the Second Sino-Japanese War. So the things that I've described so far in the story are fictionalized, but some of the experiences of the character are ultimately based on my maternal grandmother. This is actually a picture of my maternal grandparents. And this is probably in the 40s. This is a picture of them in 1948. That's my grandmother on the left, my grandfather on the right. They're standing with my great-grandparents in the middle there. My grandmother's sibling, her sister-in-law is right next to her. In the front is actually my grandmother's younger sister. That's my mom. She's a baby in front there. So in a way, I'm in the picture too. But anyway, some of the exploits, in the story, the characters have to evade the Japanese who are encroaching. And some of the exploits of the uncle are based on some of the exploits of my great-grandfather during the Second Sino-Japanese War and evading the Japanese. The next story is called The Night of Broken Glass, and the origins of this story actually, I first got the germ of the idea when I was in Shanghai, in China, for the first time in 2010. And I attended the World Exposition. This is a picture of the China Pavilion at the World Exposition. And I was at the Israeli Pavilion, and I saw a plaque dedicated to a man named He Fengshan or Ho Fengshan. And the plaque was thanking him for saving Jewish lives during the Second World War. And I wondered why I had never heard of him and why this story wasn't better known. And he was a diplomat. This is a picture of He Fengshan. He was a diplomat. He went on eventually to be an ambassador to places like Mexico and Egypt. And so he wound up writing a very obscure diplomatic memoir, which I read. And he doesn't say very much about his time in Austria during the time of Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, because he earned something of a black mark from the Chinese government. The Chinese government didn't really want him writing these exit visas, so he didn't say very much about it. But his son, who's on the left there, wound up becoming something of a prominent scientist in the United States and wrote his own obscure memoir, scientific memoir, which I read. And he actually talks more about his father and that time in Austria around the Night of Broken Glass. The woman beside He Fengshan there is actually his third wife. His first wife died of tuberculosis, and his second wife, who is the source of tension in the story for both husband and son, was a woman named Grace, and that was the second wife. And the Night of Broken Glass, of course, was a pogrom, November 9th and 10th, 1937. It took place not only in Austria, but in Germany as well. This is a photograph from Germany. You can see why Kristallnacht is referred to as such, right? This is another, oh, I'm sorry. This is another picture from Germany. You can see like Jewish storefronts smashed. And you can see, of course, ominously above the man in the middle there, the swastika, either hanging or reflected in that window there, in the glass. But through the exploits of people like Hong San, Jewish immigrants, did make it to Shanghai, where they established a Jewish quarter. Here's one family on Tongsanjie, or Tongsan Road in Shanghai. The next story, and by the way, I'm going to be moving quickly through these last few stories, and then I'll read some of my work. This story, actually, this story was the last story written for the collection. It was actually my Canadian editor who asked me to add a story to the collection after the manuscript sold. And the reason is, between 1937, the previous story, and the next story, which is set in the 80s, there's a big gap in time, right? And so these are stories covering a century, and the editor said, I want you to add a story that takes place during the 50s, 60s, or 70s, and I want you to just fill that gap in time. I don't care where you said it or what it's about, but I just want you to write another story. And so I did a lot of research, rooting around, reading about the Chinese diaspora, and I settled on the Chinese diaspora in South Africa, which I found fascinating. In particular, I read about a fishing pier on a beach near the village of Shonmakaska. And this is not the pier, but there was a pier that the Chinese of Port Elizabeth were allowed to use. So whites were allowed to use one end of the pier, the end that was farthest out to sea, and blacks were allowed to use the end of the pier that was closest to shore. And Chinese were in the middle of this pier. And so to me, it just seemed like a perfect metaphor for the liminal space that Asians often occupy in a racialized society between black and white. And so that was sort of the beginning of the story, the genesis of the story. Port Elizabeth is the only city in South Africa where the Chinese were forcibly moved under apartheid to what was known as, group area. And that's because this Chinese school was established in the neighborhood of Kabega in the 1940s, and that became the basis for forcibly moving all the Chinese to this neighborhood in Port Elizabeth. Here are some students at the school in the 40s. I actually wound up writing a story that goes from the 40s all the way to the 70s. I basically covered all of it through this story, through the backstory. The narrator's mother's side of the family runs a shop in South End. I actually describe the stores as the signs of the family stores, family grocers, general dealers. The narrator's father's side of the family has been in South Africa since, for a long time, since the late 19th century. Her narrator's great-grandfather came to mine for gold, and like many Chinese who were part of the system of the coolie system, they were brought to South Africa to do difficult and dangerous work. In the 50s, apparently Chinese liked to take wedding photos on the steps of this building at Witwatersrand University. And so the narrator's father attends Witwatersrand University as a medical student, but at the time, the course of study was segregated. So there were certain patients, Asians weren't allowed to treat, certain cadavers they weren't allowed to touch, etc. So all of this is backstory in everything in between. The story actually takes place in the early 70s when Chinese were allowed to move out of the group area and buy a house in a white neighborhood, except that in order to buy a house in a white neighborhood, all the neighbors had to agree that you could buy the house. So that's actually the premise of the story, is that this family starts a house hunt, and the mother wants to buy a house in a white neighborhood so that her kids can go to a better school. And the narrator's father has mixed feelings about this. So yeah, the last stories I'm going to move through more quickly. Belsize Park is a story about a British Chinese student at Oxford. I was a summer student there many years ago. Did in fact go to Lady Margaret Hall, which is pictured here, like the narrator. And the narrator has a girlfriend who goes to Magdalen College, and this is a picture of college balls. And they meet at a college ball. This is a picture of a college ball at Magdalen in the 80s. And the premise of the story is that they've been dating for a short time, and then she invites him to meet her parents in London. And so the story has something of a guess who's coming to dinner sort of premise. And so they go to London, and her parents live in a neighborhood called Belsize Park, which is not far from Hampstead Heath. And this is a picture, I've spent time in both Oxford and London, in part, during the year I was in Norwich. And so this is a picture I took of a villa in Belsize Park, and I imagine parents living in a villa much like these in the story. All Hallows is actually the first story I wrote for the collection. At the time, it was just a very discreet project. I didn't know it was going to become part of something larger. It's about a Chinese-American hockey player who's washed up. He's still in love with his ex-wife. I did go to school, as Dan mentioned, at Florida State. So the story is set in Tallahassee. It's also set on the Gulf Coast in a little town called Apalachicola. This is the Gibson Inn, which features in the story. This is where my in-laws live, actually. As I said, he's a washed-up hockey player, and by the beginning of the story, he's already washed up. The story is really about him working as a drug mule because he's behind on alimony, and that makes him forget it's Halloween, and he's trying to make it up to his sons. That's really the premise of the story. But he grew up in New York, and he dreamed of being a professional hockey player. And he loved the Rangers. This is a picture of Larry China Clipper Kwong. His nickname was a China Clipper, and he was actually the first player to break the color barrier in the National Hockey League. He actually broke the color barrier 10 years before Willie O'Ree, the first black hockey player, except he only played 1 minute in the third period of the only game he was allowed to play. So it was sort of a technical first, and this character, Ernie Wang, really wants to be a real star, but he washes up. So I'm not going to say too much about We Two Alone, except to say that it is about a Chinese-American Shakespearean actor. The story is set in Los Angeles and Boston, but primarily New York. And because he's a Shakespearean actor, and he's estranged from his wife, and he may be losing his memory. This is how the novella begins. He goes up on a line. He can't remember a line on stage. He may be losing his memory, like his mother. But We Two Alone comes from a line in King Lear, which is the performance he's putting on. We Two Alone will sing like birds in the cage. That's why in the Canadian edition of the book, you see the birds, the cage. And then the passage goes on to talk about laughing like gilded butterflies, hence the U.S. cover, the gilded butterflies. Normally I don't say too much about this story because I read from it, but I think I'm going with a game time decision. I'm going to read something else. I'm going to, Dad mentioned liking The Night of Broken Glass. I think I'm going to read the opening of that story and then a little bit of the later section. It won't be too long, but I think this will, I think I'm going to go with my game time decision. All right, so The Night of Broken Glass. Before the war, when we lived in Vienna, I made a habit of greeting my father when he came home from work. The Steiner School let out at 3 o'clock, which gave me time to walk a good half-mile from the Graben in the 1st District to our townhouse in the 3rd, change out of my uniform, ask the cook for something to eat, and read a Saint Mao or Tintin comic, all before my father returned. My reward for standing at the door was usually little more than a nod or a grunt of approval. Still, I met him every day because I loved and respected him and felt it my duty. One day my father came home in his flannel suit, top coat, and snap-brim fedora, his briefcase and unused umbrella in hand. The day had been fair, with nothing to trouble my walk home, but my father stepped through the door with a deep furrowed look. Now that the world was topsy-turvy, he often returned from the legation, or rather, since March, the Chinese Consulate General of the German province of Ostmark, with a harried expression. But that day his face was grave, almost ashen, and my meeting went unacknowledged. And my greeting went unacknowledged. Reflexively, he asked our manservant for the day's briefing. With eyes downcast, old Chow reported that the American had visited again. My father remained calm, with the hat traveling from his hand to old Chow's, hitched in midair. The American, whom I had never met, was an old high school classmate of my mother's, apparently in Europe on business. When my father had proposed dinner, my mother had said, "He's not so important, not like one of your dignitaries," in a tone that left me unsure who was being slighted. So I was surprised, as my father must have been, that the man had come calling for the second time that week. Over dinner, my parents said little. Curiously, my mother made no mention of her friends, and my father did not deign to ask. He did, however, make a show of reading the paper. At the end of the meal, in an overflow of irritation, my mother criticized the cook for the profiteroles. Too dense, she said, and too soggy. The cook, a hobbled old woman they had brought with them from China, listened with head bowed before backing out of the room. My father set down his paper with a crackle. "Why do you ask her to make things she doesn't know how to make?" "Because I want to eat them. But there's no need to scold." My mother smiled, as if at a child's fanciful idea. "You coddle them." "No, I considered." My mother lifted her eyes to the ceiling, then left the room, and my father shook his head, trying to understand how, with so much going on in the world, his wife could possibly fret over profiteroles, or as she put it in her American way, cream puffs. I met my mother for the first time when I was 6. I say mother because that was what I was expected to call her, and did, though in fact she was my stepmother. My real mother died of tuberculosis when I was 5. A year later, my father came home with a new wife. He'd been studying international law in Chicago, despite already having a PhD in political economics from the University of Munich. While he was gone, I received a series of brightly colored linen postcards of the World's Fair, the Hall of Science, the Avenue of Flags, the iron lattice towers of the Sky Ride. The theme of the fair was a century of progress. That's where my father met Grace. It was a windless, thick-aired summer day in Changsa when a motor car saddled with steamer trunks pulled up in front of our house, and a woman in a white blouse, wide-legged trousers, and large sunglasses climbed out. She was beautiful, which made me sad for my mother and scornful of my father, and she looked too fair to be Chinese. As it turned out, she was half Chinese, born of a Chinese father and a German-American mother. That, along with her clothes and her beauty, made her unlike any woman I had ever seen. My father had secured a large 2-story house on the outskirts of town and staffed it with half a dozen servants, all in an effort to make his new wife comfortable. But as soon as they arrived, he was stricken by all he had not foreseen. The house had no running water, and Grace refused to use the privy, which had no seat, and emitted at that time of year an audible drone. After pleading with Grace in hushed tones, my father ordered old Chow into town for a portable commode, a trip of at least 3 hours. For the rest of the afternoon, my new mother paced the courtyard, smoking one lucky after another, which made her seem feral and caged. If I kept my distance that day and in the first appraising weeks to come, it was because she didn't speak a word of Chinese, and I didn't yet speak English. My father hired a tutor, but Grace learned to say only a few innocent things, and only in the toneless way of foreigners. Our only hope then was that I learned English, which I did soon enough, through sheer exposure. Grace spoke in torrents and paused only to teach me phrases like, hot diggity dog, and now you're on the trolley, which, when repeated by me, elicited barking laughter from her. Needless to say, Grace was unhappy in China. Though my father had no particular desire to leave, he began to eye the foreign service. When the governor for whom he worked recommended the post of first secretary in the Chinese legation in Austria, my father accepted for Grace's sake. We arrived in Vienna in June of my 10th year, after a 3-week voyage on the Conte Verde via Saigon, Singapore, Madras, Bombay, Aden, and Port Said. The city was glorious with summer, and everywhere open-air orchestras paid homage to the old masters, which made our lives seem set to music. Many nights my parents put on tails and gown and went to balls and receptions, living at last the life they were meant to live. At first everything did seem better, but it wasn't long before Grace again felt stranded. She could no more distinguish der, die, and das than she could first and second tones. Then, in the spring, German troops goose-stepped through the Ringstrasse, just blocks away from our townhouse. The crowds that greeted them were lusty, adoring, as was I. My schoolboy fantasies of soldiers and guns come to life. My father did not raise his arm, but he didn't stop me from raising mine. That night, in a scene that would soon become commonplace, hoodlums took to the streets, smashing the windows of certain homes and shops. Thereafter, walking to and from school, I passed storefronts marked Jude and Nicht Errichtes Geschäft, and blocked by baby-faced men in jackboots and flared helmets. As a visible foreigner and part of the diplomatic corps, my father felt undeterred and often went into these stores despite the piercing glares, and once despite an arm held stiffly against his chest. For my mother, annexation was yet another rung of descent in a private tragedy. She chided my father for bringing her to a Nazi-occupied country. His answer, better the Germans than the Japanese. At the end of October, thousands of Polish-born Jews were rounded up and sent back to Poland. When a 17-year-old boy learned that his family was among those languishing at the border, unwanted by either side, he walked into the German embassy in Paris and pumped 5 bullets into the viscera of a minor German diplomat. And 2 days later, Ernst von Rath died of his wounds. The seething of the Germans, in check so long as their countrymen clung to life, would now be unleashed. This was what my father knew when he came home that afternoon. Okay, I'm just going to read a little bit more. And so what happens eventually in the story is that Ho Fengshan is asked by a friend of his to bring some visas to her house because she and her husband can't leave. It's not safe. And so this is a scene, this is part of the scene from when he goes to deliver the visas. She had hardly finished when they heard a knock on the door. The knock was urgent, as if someone being pursued was desperate to be let in. She and my father exchanged looks, then returned to the living room, where the maid was already approaching the door. Soon a brusque voice said, "What do you mean, God greets you? Heil Hitler." Then 2 men in plain clothes barged in. "Firearms search," one of them announced. "We've already been searched," Ruth replied calmly. "Twice. And we're searching again." The man turned to my father. "Who are you?" "A friend," he replied unhelpfully. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for the man in the house." The plainclothesman frowned. Among the reasons must have been my father's impeccable German. "Show your identification." My father, seated again, released a veil of smoke. "By rights, we should see yours first, unless we're no longer following protocol." the man's face contorted. Our leader has said you foreigners no longer have special privileges, so you have no right to be so impudent. The other man, gangling, pocked with acne scars, and impatient with the scene, began to stalk the apartment. Soon drawers were yanked, overturned, menageries of glass swept to the floor. Ruth tensed. You foreigners have taken what is rightfully ours, the first man continued, eyeing the room as if it were full of spoils. What you saw last night was the outraged soul of the German people. The man went on grandiloquently. Eventually the other returned, having failed, it seemed, to discover anything. Who are you? He said. Without waiting for the answer, he reached into his greatcoat, pulled out a revolver, and aimed it at my father. I will stop there. Thank you very much. Well, thank you.
I was going to say, Jack, part of the master class talked about withholding information.
That's withholding too much. Thanks for your attention. Are there any questions?
I have a question about all the research. That, like, where can you talk to us a little bit about the writing, the workflow of the writing process for you? Like, where did you start a story? How much research happens? When are you researching versus writing?
Yeah.
The relationship between those parts of the process.
Yeah, I mean, as these photographs suggest, I do a fair bit of research. Necessarily had to do a fair bit of research. There were only some parts of the story that were drawn directly from family history, for example, like my grandmother's, a little bit of my paternal grandmother's experiences during the Second Sino-Japanese War. And so, I should, back up a little bit and just say that, I've written a couple of semi-autobiographical novels that I've put in the drawer. And for me, I just found that refracting my own experience through different times and places made the stories more interesting. And, but part of the challenge, of course, is teaching yourself a lot of things first, a lot of things you're not necessarily expert on. For example, I've never lived in South Africa, never been to South Africa, and so I had to do a lot of reading. I've heard a few things about the Second Sino-Japanese War, but really didn't know a whole lot about it. These are not things you learn, in Canada, where I grew up. Unlikely to learn about something like the Second Sino-Japanese War in the U.S. And so, in some cases, I have to read a good number of books before I can even embark on writing the story. So, for the nature of things, I read, a number of books on the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Night of Broken Glass I mentioned, I read those memoirs, obscure memoirs, but also read books on Kristallnacht. And, I like to cite Hilary Mantel, who says that the task of historical fiction is to take the past out of the archive and relocate it in a body. And, the difficulty with doing all that reading is it feels like you're armed with all this knowledge now, but it's really a superabundance of information. It's way too much. And the challenge then becomes, well, how do I write, bring all of that archival information or knowledge down to eye level, through the experience of an individual, so that my story is not merely exemplar. Like, this is what it was like to be in the middle of this war. What's it like to, to live in South Africa, to have the story feel like exemplar. Now, this is something I frequently find myself saying to students, that their premise might be interesting, but they haven't fully relocated it in a body And that's when it just feels like, okay, this is merely exemplar. So sometimes I do a lot of the research in advance, but sometimes I find, one form of writer's block is when you don't have the knowledge to write authoritatively about what you want to write about. And sometimes if you are writing and you find yourself stuck, it may be that you lack knowledge or information, and sometimes in the middle of composition, you have to go off and do more research. I mean, right now I'm working on a novel, I was cruising along, and then I got to basic training. It's a novel set in the Second World War, and I wanted to know more about basic training, and I tried to write it, because I was just like, I gotta keep moving forward. Then I just found like I couldn't write anything that convinced myself. And so I dug around some more, and it's like, then there's a document called Standard Syllabus for Basic Training, 1942. It's like, I got to see the standard syllabus. And then at that point, it's like, I can't go on until I have that document. And I was like begging the Canadian War Museum, I can't wait 4 to 6 weeks, I need it yesterday, And fortunately, they're able to turn it around in just a few days. But that's a case where, like, I couldn't make it up. Like, some people can. I've heard, apparently Edward P. Jones, when he was writing about, writing The Known World, and it's about the world of slavery, and it's about the interesting phenomenon of how some African Americans owned slaves. People apparently asked him, how did you come to understand this world? And he said, you just make it up. And of course, you have to make up many things. But for me, like, if I don't have like some kind of baseline accuracy, it's hard to convince myself, much less anybody else. So that's how research works for me.
I was wondering, when you're choosing historically, what inspires the characters and the setting and the context and everything, were you conscious through the collection of how those particular historical moments and stories could speak to something that's happening in the present?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I never feel like I'm just writing about the past, right? I always feel like when I'm writing about the past, the present is being refracted. And this was especially true when I was writing about South Africa. Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, she talks specifically about Nazi Germany, she talks about, of course, slavery in the US, and she talks about the caste system in India. She triangulates these. She doesn't talk very much about South Africa, but obviously that's another example of a very codified caste system. And it was really interesting to read about the election of the nationalist government, because it was like nobody thought the nationalists and the Afrikaner parties were going to win, and D.F. Malan became the prime minister with less than half the votes. And as I'm writing all this stuff about the past, like, this is what's going on in America, like right now, right? Like, this is, nobody thought it was going to win. It didn't even get, a plurality, etc. So, that's just a very explicit example of how, I always felt like when I was writing the past, I was also writing about the present. And when I started the collection, all of the stories I pursued were sort of just discrete interests. And I wrote All Hallows first, and then I wrote the Valkyries, and maybe that's when I had the first inkling that I might connect these two hockey stories. I actually wrote the two hockey stories first. With each successive story, it became more deliberate where the story was going to be set and when. Once I got the sense that I wanted to cover the diaspora of the century. And then, of course, the last story that I mentioned, Everything in Between Sentence, that was very, very strategic, because I thought okay, if I have to add a story, as my editor suggested, why not venture to another continent? You know, in fact, the story ventures to 2 different continents. And that was very strategic, because now you could say the collection was not set on 3 continents, but 5 continents, which sounds suddenly more global, right, than 3. I mean, 3 is okay, but it doesn't sound that.
But it's no 5.
Yeah, it's not 5, right? It doesn't sound quite as global or epic in scope. So with each successive story, the choice of, you know, where and when to set the story became more deliberate.
Thank you so much. I had to step out for a minute, so if I'm asking about something you already talked about, just be like, next, and ignore me. But I was really just in the first part of your talk when you were showing this collection of images that you amassed during the project. I think this picks up on the question that you were responding to about research, but I'm really curious about the role of those images in your research practice, and it felt to me like as you were talking to them that they became part of a process for you of you were talking about kind of embodying this time in a kind of specificity.
Right.
So I'm curious about like the relationship. I know also that in giving presentations like these, it can be the visuals can help kind of ground a conversation.
Right.
So I'm just curious, like putting that aside, like where those images came to you in the practice of research, like how they relate to the work, and also because I haven't yet had an opportunity to see a physical copy of the book, like if they ever end up being published as part of the work, what I'm curious about.
Yeah, the photographs, you know, none of the photographs, none of the research appears, or none of the photographs are reproduced in the book. I'm a fairly visual person, and for me, as I was suggesting earlier, if I can't really convince myself, I'm not convinced that I can convince anybody else. And often a story, it just doesn't live in my own imagination until it's anchored with those kind of everyday authenticated details. So for example, that picture of the back room with the laundry, yeah, one could make it up, you know, and one, and can be just as convincing, but you know, for me, it was looking at that photograph and then describing the butcher paper that was over the windows and so on. Those sorts of details make their way into the story. And for me, the Vancouver Archives is a wonderful research. For me, I really like to ground the stories in some kind of image. You know, it gives me a foothold in the world. I was talking before about a superabundance of information. Like you can read a lot of stuff about Kristallnacht, but the tough thing is you're trying to write about a middle-class Viennese household, and then you want to know what did that look like in the 40s, right? And that's like a different kind of knowledge that you can't just look up in a work of history. And that's, in fact, what most of the history books will leave out. And so the task of the fiction writer is to look for different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of information. And sometimes, yes, you just have to make it up. Or you have to, you know, go with your understanding of an era or analogous situations or what have you. But I find it extremely helpful to be grounded in the image. And frequently, not just for tone or something more abstract, but to literally pluck the details. Yeah. All right. Any?
Essentially, just as a very quick follow-up, because you described part of this process too as being like, I'm writing, I'm going, then I have to like maybe stop because I can't convincingly make up basic training. Right?
Right.
Was there a moment for any of the stories in this book or for the novel that you work on now where you had a plan, maybe you had written a bunch of things forward one direction and then you hit something in the research that made you go, oh damn, I have to stop and rethink this, or where historical reality butted up against either where you thought you were going or where you'd already gone, and you had to make like the hard choices about how faithful to reality do I have to be here?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Because on the one hand, you know, I I'm writing these stories that I hope have a certain fidelity to life. But at the same time, the novel or book or story is a closed system. And it only has to make sense internally. It doesn't have to be totally accurate to the world. And so sometimes I'm writing this, I'm working on this novel, it's set during the Second World War, and there are times where I say to myself, it doesn't matter if there's a fidelity to what actually happened, so long as the, internal logic is consistent, So there's nothing that, I can't think of an example where, maybe because a lot of the research comes in advance, I can't think of anything where midstream I was totally had to rethink in a radical way the whole story. Because there does come a point where you say to yourself, well, is it internally consistent, in this closed world of the novel? I am, of course, cognizant when it comes to something like basic training that a lot of people have been through it, right? And people would be quick to tell you if you're like way off. So that's something where it's tough to fudge, right? Because it's a common enough experience that people will correct you. But there are many things, many details where it's like it doesn't matter, as long as within the world of the novel, it's consistent or makes sense.
Thank you
So
so much.
thank you so much for being here.
I'll just quickly hop up to do an admonition.
Sure,
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Jack. It's such a treat to see some of the images that inspired this work too. I appreciate that. That's wonderful. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. My quick reminder is, first of all, you can buy We Two Alone at Buffalo Street Books if you're feeling like supporting a local independent bookstore. That would be lovely, and it's available wherever else you buy books.
I should also say that there's a cool audiobook version for those who like to listen. So
An audiobook version with narrators, male and female narrators who are sort of voicing these roles. And so at your book launch, didn't you have one of the...
yeah, I had a virtual launch, and one of the audiobook narrators, I invited him to read. And so that was cool because I just wanted to give the audience kind of different experience, and it lent itself to the Zoom environment.
Yeah, so that's really great that's out there. And my last admonition is we have one more Visiting Writer Series event this semester, and it is virtual. It's an online-only event. Kazim Ali on November 9th will be doing a master class called Ecologies of Form. I should note, Kazim Ali is a poet, a nonfiction writer, a fiction writer. His most recent publication is a choose-your-own-adventure book. The one before that is a memoir of his time in Canada as a child, where he goes back and confronts the ecological damage and the damage to the local indigenous peoples that his father contributed to. He was working on a dam in this region, and he sort of discovers a rash of suicides from the indigenous community in that area. He just reaches out to find out what has happened there, and ends up being invited back to come home. And he goes, that's more than I asked for. I just wanted to touch base, but okay. And prior to that was a book with 3 very long poems. So this is someone who writes in all genres in really interesting ways. On November 9th, you will hear me reminding you of it in whatever capacity brought you here tonight. So that's coming up, and I would just ask you to join me once more in thanking Jack Wang. Here's a quick tour through the stories. So.